Joining us now from Beijing, Wenping is a professor and director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. With us in the studio, Sourabh Gupta is a resident senior fellow with the Institute for China-America Studies. From Bahrain, Abdulateef Al-Mulhim is a columnist for two Saudi newspapers, Yaum and Arab News. And also with us in the studio, Crowley is a professor and fellow at the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Wenping, let me start with you. When one looks at China's relationship with the rest of the world, its diplomacy, if you like, would it be fair to say that Beijing is driven primarily by its economic interests in the rest of the world, rather than other factors like security or ideology or military dominance?
Well, it is quite simple because China, at the current moment, we are only enjoy the competitive advantage in the economic means. Now, China is the second biggest economy, but we are not the second biggest like a military power. We are either not, even not the third biggest like cultural power or other means. So only for this economic means, now relatively speaking, is stronger. So that's why Chinese government put forward this One Belt, One Road strategy. It's also eyes on to expand the economic links with other countries. So it's basically so we can offer those economic help or strengthened economic cooperation. But we are building on other those strengths, like you mentioned, politically, diplomatically, and also militarily, culturally. But I would like to add, diplomatically, yeah, China has its strengths. For example, we are one of those 5 permanent members in the UN Security Council. But on the other hand, because our foreign policy has been long saying abide by this non-interference policy, so that gave us some limitations, saying if you go all the way to those conflict area, probably it's difficult to handle the balance between the policy we have been long abide by and also how much we should involve with those conflict resolution. So we are still at the process of learning by doing.
Right, Crowley, what do you see as the overriding aim of Chinese diplomacy right now?
I think that's a very good question. Certainly, Chinese power and influence begins on the economic front. As Professor He said, it is now the second leading economy in the world, and that does give China resources to develop military capabilities and to develop more political influence. I think China is still struggling to try to determine, how to exercise this growing power. I think in Chinese foreign policy today, it's about things it doesn't like. It doesn't like to see countries like the United States interfere in the affairs of other countries around the world. But it's unclear to me how China is prepared to exercise its influence towards what strategic end. Its immediate interests are in its own backyard. How it extends this global influence over time, we'll have to wait and see.
Right, China may not like how things are done, say, by the United States or other members of the UN Security Council, the Permanent Five I'm talking about, yet we always see consensus.
I think there are overlapping interests between the United States and China, and obviously we'll see some of that coming up in the summit between President Xi and President Trump. But saying there's a synergy in terms of common interest doesn't necessarily mean there's necessarily a clear path forward. North Korea would be a perfect example. Right. There's a shared goal of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but there are very divergent views as to how to get to that point. I do think that the Trump administration, through some of its early decisions, declaring an end to the TPP, yesterday's decision regarding rolling back climate regulations will provide China with a considerable amount of leeway. President Xi has already positioned himself as a leading defender of globalization. He could very well become a leading defender regarding climate change as well. So I think there are common interests here, but I do think that the United States and China still look at the world in fundamentally different ways.
Okay, Abdulateef, let's talk about China in the Middle East. Here you have the Middle East, a region which is unstable, it's very volatile. we had King Salman of Saudi Arabia just visiting Beijing, and there were some trade deals signed with the Chinese, $65 billion worth of trade deals. How does Saudi Arabia view the relationship with China?
By the way, the Saudi relations with China go back a little bit further, further than what many people think. As a matter of fact, the Chinese relation with the Middle East had an advantage, but at that time, a long time ago, the Chinese didn't know it. This is why the Chinese economic relation with the Middle East and Saudi Arabia in particular technically, exceeded the expectation. At certain time, the China was looking at the Middle East in a very, very different way, and the Middle East we are looking at China in a very different way. The different culture, different language, different everything. But as I said, the Chinese didn't know that they have an advantage, especially in the Middle East and Northern Africa, when they were still having memories of the old colonizing Europe. And when China came in, China used the old American way in the 30s, 40s, and up to the 70s, which is a soft way, coming in for business and business only. And this is what many countries in the Middle East like. They want a country to come to, to deal with them without interfering in their own internal affairs. And this is what China did. They came in mainly for economic, but then they went to the other steps. In the past, the relation between the Middle East and China and Saudi Arabia and China is economic, but now it's going a little bit steps further, even security, even in the military. We saw Chinese naval ship coming, docking a port in the port of Jeddah of Saudi Arabia, and we are seeing extremely extended and expanding relation between Saudi Arabia and China, and this relation had increased after the Chinese diplomatic visits to Saudi Arabia and the Saudi politicians visiting China, putting in their mind that China does represent the second to none as a superpower, economic, political, and military.
Sourabh, as we just heard there, China is expanding its trade and economic relationship with many countries around the world, like Saudi Arabia. But in terms of its political and diplomatic influence, what does China actually bring to the table? During that meeting that President Xi had with King Salman, he indicated that the key to resolving political problems is economic development.
Yes, that's the way the Chinese have looked at it, is that if countries can become more economic prosperous, some of those problems amongst themselves could fade away or dissipate or not be such a trenchant issue. But ever since I would say the mid-70s or the early 70s, China has been very clear and very firm that it does not want to interfere in the internal affairs of nations. And to the extent that it also, even in a case like North Korea, where perhaps China would benefit from interfering more extensively in North Korean politics to its benefit and to the region's benefit, China has desisted going down this path. And that's why we have situations where China, because it stays out of those internal political issues, can have good relations with countries which are otherwise at loggerheads with each other. And we see that in the case of Saudi Arabia and Iran, where it has good relations with both, but it is not going to support either country in doing insurrectionist or insurrectionist moves in, say, a third country. And so it assists Chinese diplomacy from, and they've hewed to that line and remained consistent to that line, and that's why I think there is a good deal of appreciation for China, that China can help grow and develop the economies, that everybody can get more prosperous without having to step on many of those very tense, difficult, or controversial issues. How long China can stay away from some of these issues as it gets involved, say with its Belt and Road Initiative, is a question which needs to be asked. But to this point of time, they've been able to manage that balance delicately and smartly.
Let me get the view on that particular issue of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries from He Wenping. So He Wenping, here we have China, which has taken a very deliberate decision that it will not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. It will not criticize other countries or make judgments on them. Has that worked for China?
I think, yes. Still, I think we are facing those challenges also with our own. For example, like we are facing this motherland reunification issue, like a Taiwan issue. So we are against the so-called one country, China. So this is also the domestic issue. We don't want the foreign powers to intervene. So that's why when we look about put ourselves in other countries' shoes, we fully understand if a country they are facing a domestic like a power struggle between one party or with another party, so that's their own issue. And also fully depend on their own people to choose who they would like to be elected, like to govern that country. So that's the domestic issue. But when we talk about like a nuclear issue in the DPRK, like even in Africa, there are like South Sudan, those civil conflict issue, but I think that's different catalog issue. Because in the DPRK nuclear issue is not only like a domestic power struggle things, it has this security influence for other countries, for the South Korea, and also to China, and also like to Russia, to Japan, to all those regional security issues. And if that's a mass destructive weapon, it goes beyond not only the region. So that's not a domestic issue in a very strict sense. So of course, China needs to join with the international society to do something to make those things not happening.